Hey guys, welcome to session 5 of our virtual workshop. In this video, we are going to be talking about advanced layout design. So in the last video, we talked about basic layout design. So now you know all the different parts of a yearbook layout and all the components that need to go into one. But now I want you to start thinking about your actual content that's going to go onto the page. Earlier in the workshop, we talked about one of my favorite phrases, which is the 6 Ps, or prior proper planning prevents poor performance. And this next one is another one of those that I kind of like put in my pocket, and I always refer back to them because it is so useful and something to remember as you're creating your yearbook pages and putting the content into your layout. And that is that your content should be king. And this is something that we use actually in the marketing world when we talk about content marketing, and that your content is really the basis of everything that you guys do. And so whenever you're telling your story, remember when we think back to what is a yearbook and why are we doing what we're doing, really what we're doing is telling our story, the story of our student body. And so the content that you need to be able to do that is the king. And so even though I do recommend that you make templates for your staff and you show them examples and you don't just tell them what to do as far as what fonts to choose and what colors to choose, but you actually show them examples, I also think that you need to give your staff the autonomy to make decisions in order to really highlight their content and give it the space that it needs. For instance, I see a lot of staffs create a template that has a really big dominant photo and it's vertical. And so they assign that template to a certain spread, and they might go down their ladder and be A, B, C, D, template A, template B, template C, template D, and really not pay attention to the content that's going on that page. When the staff member gets that template, they might look at it and be like, okay, I'm going to fill in these boxes with these pictures, and they don't actually fit in those boxes. And so you end up having a really horizontal swimming picture in a really vertical box. And so you're really not letting the content be the king and letting your staff member redesign that layout within the parameters of your theme, obviously, to let the content be accommodated by a template that makes sense. So that's the first thing. With any of these tools or techniques that I'm going to show you in this video, I want you to keep in mind that your primary goal is showcasing the content that you have in the best way possible in order to tell the best story. And so if that means changing something up or being inspired by a certain template and using it to create your own, that is totally okay. I like to kind of think about if you are on a boat and your whole staff is on a boat, they can go anywhere they want on the boat, but they can't necessarily get off the boat and start walking on the ocean, right? We're all in the same boat. So we have the same guardrails in mind, the same parameters, the same limitations, the same ideas, same font, same colors, same design elements, graphic elements, that kind of stuff. But you can go anywhere you want on the boat. You can design your layout anywhere you want or any way you want within those parameters, if that makes sense. So there's two main ways of organizing your templates for your book. The first is going to be what we call a traditional, which is kind of like the layout we created in the last session. So we have a dominant photo, we have captions, we have 5 to 8 photos. We might swap out one of those sections for a module like we talked about at the end of the last video, but generally it's a very traditional way of thinking about a yearbook layout. The other way is to do a modular based layout. So basically what that means is instead of having one module on your spread, it's kind of taking all of your content and putting it into modules. It also helps your staff be able to break down how to design content, because when you open your yearbook spread and it's this big blank page, it can be really intimidating to know where to start, and you just start dropping photos in there and it just becomes a mess because you're not designing things with intention. And sometimes it's a lot easier to worry about just designing a little tiny space instead of designing the entire spread as a whole. So with a modular layout, you're basically looking at breaking down your content into individual sections. And so each individual section has its own type of content. And so it might have a headline, a subhead, it'll have a storytelling element like a caption or a mini story, and it'll also have photos. It also has design elements that group it together. So with this spread in particular, I blocked off each kind of module with a different color. So we kind of have two dominant sections. We have one on the left, which is this big pink section. Then we have the dominant photo in the middle. The green really is the dominant because it's one photo versus like 3 mini stories on the left. So because that photo is so much bigger, I would call that the dominant. Then we have multiple miniature or smaller sections, kind of like a medium, like the red one at the bottom, which is just photos and captions, but it's also a module by itself. And then we have the little what happened, which is the section blue underneath my face. And then we have 2 really tiny sections or modules, which is the yellow and the purple. And so when we look at that spread by itself, you notice that there's lots of white space in between the different sections. And that's done intentionally to draw the eye to those individual sections by themselves. It's also referred to as a squish and a separate. And so what happens is within a module, you squish your content together closer. Sometimes half a pica is your internal spacing, and then you separate the modules apart from each other. Sometimes you might have 3 or 4 picas in between each section. It really just depends on your particular aesthetic. But again, the most important thing is always consistency. So whatever you've decided your squish metric to be, if it's a pica, half a pica, a quarter pica, and whatever you've decided your separate metric to be, whether it be 3, 4 picas, whatever it is, just be consistent throughout your entire book. Not just the layout, the entire book. But first, let's talk about traditional layouts and how to use them, and then we'll jump back into talking about modules. The first thing you need to know is that using traditional layouts does not have to be boring. There are a lot of great books that do really great work, tell really good stories, winning awards that use traditional based layouts. There's no right or wrong preference. There's no even industry standard with this. It's totally your preference, and a lot of it has to go back to your theme. What layout type will do the best to tell your story? Yes, modules are becoming more and more popular, and they're kind of what we're seeing a lot of, but that does not mean that there's anything wrong with doing traditional base layouts. So what I like to do is start with what I call your base template. This is something that is just like what we designed in the last video, where it's a dominant photo, a story, photos below, and then captions. You might swap one of these caption areas out for a secondary coverage. That's totally fine, but your base template is what we did in the first video. And so then what you're going to do is maybe you decide as a staff, you come up with 3 to 4 base templates that you're going to use. And then you're going to make different versions of those base templates. So you're going to have like base template A version 1, 2, 3, 4, base template B version 1, 2, 3, 4. So that way, all throughout your book, you have a lot of consistency, but it's also varied. And so let's talk a little bit more about those versions. So this is, like I said, the first base template. And what you're going to do is you're going to flip and rotate these templates in order to create more versions. And so the first thing we're going to do is just rotate it 180 degrees. And then you start to see you have the exact same layout, but you have a different orientation. And so obviously the story is going to flip. You're going to put the headline probably above the story. All of your, pictures and stuff though are going to stay the same. They're just in a different orientation. Then you're going to go ahead and mirror that. And so the story is going to be on the bottom right instead of where it originally was. And again, your headline is probably going to go above it, but it's going to stay within that story block. And then the last time you're going to rotate that around. And so you end up with 4 different variations of spreads that all look very cohesive together because they're the same spread. They're just oriented differently. And so like I said, you're going to have 2 or 3 base templates that you then flip around and rotate. And that becomes what you guys apply to your spreads and then fill with content. And then, like I said, you're going to take that layout, you might drop out some of that content and put secondary coverage. So when we swap out content like this picture and this caption for a headshot or a module or timeline or something like that, it's a lot more engaging for the reader. And so that's why modular layouts are really popular, because instead of just one module per spread, it's actually a whole spread of all modules. This has really gained a lot of popularity over the years, but because it's so different than traditional layouts, and really you're kind of designing a bunch of tiny little spreads, it can kind of be hard to make the shift in your mind from traditional base layouts to the modular type. So one way that I like to teach this is using what I call the puzzle piece method. So basically it's just a way to break down all of your sections into individual interchangeable pieces that you can then puzzle piece together to create your layouts. So I'll walk you through the whole thing. So with our base template that we use for modular layouts, you're more so looking for your sections. And so here you have 4 main sections, and this is based off of a grid versus columns. Personally, I just like working with a grid. I don't feel as restricted as I do with columns, and I also have guidelines horizontally as well as vertically, but it's up to you. You don't have to use a grid if you prefer the columns. But what you want to do is create some templates templates that give you the sections that you need. So this might be template A, and then we're going to create variations of it, just like we did with the traditional one, but in a different way. You are going to go ahead and create 3 to 4 other base templates. This one, you might have these 4 sections. Another one, you might have less sections or more sections. You might have a really tall and skinny section. There's lots of different ways that you can do this, but basically you want to decide on various ways that you can create content within these individual sections as modules. So some things to remember about this concept is that each section is interchangeable. So even though the top section is long and skinny, and that really lends itself to being something like a timeline, you can also break that up into multiple sections and put various types of content in there, not just long and skinny types of things. Modules also help you organize content and vary the content and go a little bit more in depth if you want to, because instead of covering one thing per spread, you could effectively cover multiple in each module, have its own piece of content. It also helps you cover more students sometimes, because in the past with the traditional layout, we might have given a whole spread or a whole like half spread, depending on how you divide up your book, to each club. And you know that there's some clubs that are less active than others. You know that there's some clubs that literally do like one thing each year, and it's like do the first meeting to get the t-shirt and whatever. And so those clubs still deserve to be in the yearbook and have coverage, but probably less coverage than a really active club on campus that has a lot of students and stuff like that. And so your spread could be about volunteering clubs, and it can cover 4 different clubs that are based on volunteering and the activities that they do, versus having a whole spread dedicated to one particular club and the 4 activities that they might have. You can actually fit a lot more content in it with this type of concept. They are generally also very reader friendly because they have intentional white space in between your different sections, which helps the reader know exactly where they're supposed to go first, second, third, and digest it in a very logical way. And then, like I said, you can also cover multiple topics on a spread. So now let's look at breaking up this actual template. So for the sake of our demonstration today, I'm going to refer to each section by letter. So this section, the long and skinny one, is going to be section A. This square section is going to be section B. This bottom, taller but medium-sized one is going to be section C, and then this giant one at the bottom is going to be section D. And so let's populate this template with content. So as you can see, it kind of faded into a template filled with content. This is also almost the same template we used when we talked about traditional layouts as well as basic layouts. You can absolutely take your basic layouts and fit them into modules and just separate out the content a little bit that way in order to have some more white space. That is also absolutely acceptable, and it's also a kind of a good segue from traditional layouts into using a modular kind of basis. But as you can see in section A, we have this timeline, which I mentioned it lends itself to something like a timeline. It's long and skinny, and you have like filler content in there. It's fake names, fake titles, fake times. Obviously those aren't going to be 4 pictures of the same person used, but you can see that there's a headline, there's a subhead, and there's visual elements that tie in the different colors we're going to use, and it shows an example of what that content might look like. Then in section B, we have a picture and a caption. Just basic. You absolutely need that kind of content too. Not every single thing on your spread has to be designed. It's not a bad idea, but sometimes you just need a caption and a headline, or a caption and a photo, and that's totally fine. Section C, we have another basic caption and headline, or caption and photo. Why do I keep saying that? Section with 2 photos. And then in our dominant, which is our biggest quadrant, our biggest section, we have a feature story, and we have a big dominant photo, a headline, a subhead, the story by, and we have our caption on top of the photo for this particular instance. This spread is good. It accomplishes everything that it's supposed to. It has a caption for every picture. It has photo buys. It has directives telling you what caption is for what picture. It has caption headlines or attention getters or action lead-ins or whatever you want to call it for each picture. It has a module, which makes it more visually interesting, gives you a little bit behind the scenes or an inside look at something. It has a feature story, which again, maybe isn't as popular, but for some reason, this is, a good reason to have a feature story, feature length story. And so this spread, grade-wise or, in terms of like, is there anything missing, it would have an A. It's a good spread. But it's not a great spread. I don't think it's super interesting to look at. There's not very much incorporation of design elements. There's colors, but there's not much else. They did do a really good job of stacking the headlines with different fonts and colors and sizes and formats. But that's really it. There isn't much else going on. And so I'm sure we can spice this up a little bit, but let's do it in a modular way. The first thing we're going to do is swap out section A for a new module. And so using that same amount of space, you're going to swap it out with a different type of content. So instead of a timeline, now we're going to do a question and answer or a Q&A or a headshots and quotes, whatever it might be. For this, we have another little headline. We still have our subhead, but we've added a mini story. So instead of like only having the subhead and just having that empty space there, we're explaining a situation or an event or a club or some sort of background and then giving student perspective on it through our quotes. So the other one featured 4 different students and the different times of their day. This one is just designed a little bit differently, and it features 7 students. This one, the theme is using that example theme of young, wild, and free. So because of the wild element, we've made things a little topsy-turvy and like slanted. And so it's a headshot, which is also an untraditional crop for a headshot. It's a little bit long and skinnier, and then it is a cutout on top of a colored background that's a little bit slanted, and then there's a border of that same exact size slanted the other way, and then they're kind of jagged next to each other. And immediately, you know, there's a lot more students in the book, but it's also kind of a little bit more visually interesting to look at. You could absolutely throw a line behind these photos and put little timestamps on there, and it's a timeline. Like, you could take this kind of design and mimic it in different types of formats also. And then for section B, we have swapped it out, let me move myself, with this football picture. And so instead of it just being a caption and a picture, we have a kind of a mini story here. And so we're not going to necessarily take this photo of him like catching a football and flying in the air and looking at the camera during a football game. That wouldn't happen unless you're literally on the field, on the floor. But you can probably take an action shot of someone running down the field and catching a football, or you can stage a picture that's like an editorial photo shoot, and you can tell a story about someone story worthy, something if you can relate to your theme, or just content that, you know, is interesting to your student body about a particular topic. You still have your headline, you have some sort of label like special feature, you have their first and last name, which is kind of the subhead, and then you also have incorporated design elements. So as part of our young, wild, and free things being slanted, we have added this little slanted kind of line behind the photo and behind the like box that we've also put in yellow in order to incorporate design elements through our spread a little bit more. So if this was your final spread, that would also look good, and you've already elevated your content just by being a little bit more intentional with your design elements than just kind of throwing a line behind some pictures and calling it a timeline. But we're going to keep going. So in section C, we have swapped out those 2 pictures and 2 captions with 4 pictures. They're a little bit smaller, which is what we want. Remember, we want large, medium, and small. We want vertical, we want horizontal, we want square. We want some pictures that are the same size and some that are varied up. We want all kinds of stuff. And so in this section, instead of just those 2, we've swapped it out with 4. We've incorporated a group caption, so we can say picture 1, 2, 3, and 4 and label them with numbers, or we can say top left, right, bottom left, bottom right. But it doesn't matter how you guys decide to do it. You can just make sure you leave space for the fact that this module is going to have room for captions. But then also notice what's in the middle right there. We've taken out a caption from what would be about this photo, and we've put it into like a quote block. And so it just incorporates another design element that we could use. This one happens to be filled in because the football guy was filled in with yellow. It could be an outline of yellow. It could be, there's so many different ways. It could be white with a shadow behind it to make it look like it's 3D. Like, there's lots of different design decisions that you guys can make, but incorporating it as a pull quote from a picture is another design element that we're introducing that we can use later on in a different module, in a different size shape or different section. Then we have our big dominant section, section D. And so we're going to swap out that big feature story for more of a quote situation. And so because feature stories are important and necessary, but not always necessary for each spread, this is a lot easier to digest. And so instead of doing a feature story or a forced feature story about some topic, this features 5 different perspectives of 5 different students. And so typically a feature story is also going to be about less kids than that. And so this gets more students in the book, more students indexed, more coverage, more perspectives, which is our overall goal. It also gave us a couple of different ways to handle our headlines. And so before, the other one we just said headline, and it was stacked. And this one gave us a little bit of dimension with the super being in the accent font and then having that like black shadow behind it. And then we're using our little kind of pseudo highlight behind the word headline with that yellow, and we've incorporated our slanted line down, bleeding off both the sides, the blue and the yellow, and kind of bridging a gap between our photo and our quote box. This spread, immediately just looking at it overall, is a lot more visually interesting to look at than the last one. And the main reason is just that we've added more. We've added more design elements. We've been really intentional with how we're using our color, how we're using our design elements, and we're not just kind of leaving the picture on there and saying it's done. But we're not done yet. We're going to keep swapping them out. So back to section A, we're going to take that, instead of having it that big long one section, we're going to break that up into 2. So like I said, content needs to drive your design. And so if you get your template and you're like, you know what, I really have this picture that kind of deserves a longer caption, pull it out and put it into its own mini story box. Design it with a little bit of intention. We put it on a layered box here with a big headline over it and gave it the space that it deserves in order to tell the story accurately. Then on the left side, pictures and captions. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with them. We still need them in the yearbook world, but we're intentional with which photos and captions we're using and how we're using them. And then for section B, we're going to swap it out to go back to the picture we originally had, but instead of just a plain caption like we had originally, we're going to swap that out with this quote box that we're borrowing from the other module that we used on template 2. And so that way, throughout the book, you see this used multiple times and it becomes a consistent visual element that you're seeing throughout the content all throughout the book. And then in section C, you'll notice something that we haven't done before. We are swapping out the section with not only a mini story, a different way of doing a title, we have the slanted lines behind there. We also have a group caption. We have multiple pictures about one topic that we're doing a group caption for. And we altered our template for the first time. So we did alter the template with section A. We split it into 2, but this one actually affected 2 different sections. And so we've taken section C, and because we have the need for that mini story right there, we've moved over section C into section D a little bit to take up the space we need to tell the story. And so that is your job as a staff member, is to take the template that you were given and figure out the best way to use the space that you have within the guardrails that you have with your style guide. Remember, we're all in the same boat, but you can go anywhere you want on the boat. All right, then for section D, we have kind of gotten rid of the story altogether. So because we have the mini story at the section A from the one that needed it to be separated out, and the pull quote really is kind of like a mini story, and the mini story of section C, you kind of don't need a feature story in section A. Even though it's the dominant, you have enough storytelling elements on this page where maybe you don't need to have a full story or quote situation or like really in-depth module here. Visually, you still need a big section to draw your attention to it, but here we've told the story with a big, long, extended quote where he's almost telling his own story because it's a quote from him. We still have a headline, and we still have it be really big and like draw your eye and serve as a attention getter, but it's not necessarily a full story as it used to be. Also, we've introduced yet another design element, which is like a box that goes around him and points to his quote, which is maybe something we've introduced on the cover or the divider pages, and we're using it again here on this dominant photo. So we've spent all this time building out all these different modules, and at this point it's just sample content. It's fake text, fake captions, fake photos, but what you created is a library of puzzle pieces. And so what happens is for this section A, you have 3 different options to be able to pick for your puzzle. And looking at your content, you can let the content be king and let that drive your design. If you know that a timeline is going to work, pick the timeline module. If you know that you need a lot of kids in the book, pick the middle one. If you know that you have something that needs a mini story, pick that top one. And you can puzzle piece your spread together based on the content that you know you need. What I've had a lot of staffs do is they'll do this. They'll spend a lot of time in the beginning of the year building these templates and building these puzzle pieces, print them out and cut them out into little sections. And then when they get their page assignments, they will take the little puzzle pieces off the wall and start literally piecing them together and see what looks good together to be able to build their spread on the fly using the content that they have for their topic. And the same thing applies for modules that apply for traditional templates. You can flip these around, you can mirror them, you can put them backwards, upside down, whatever. Like the content itself, the sections are going to be the same size regardless of what orientation they're in. And so the more you switch things around, the more varied it's going to look, but it's still going to have the same consistent look and feel because the size of the sections are the same. And like I said, you're not just going to have this one base template. Ideally, you're going to have 3 or 4. Okay, so now when it comes to designing with modules, there's a couple things that I want to remind you and things that you need to keep in mind. So the first thing is spacing. Remember we talked about the squish and the separate concept of modules in particular, of giving everything room to breathe. And so what you'll see here is there's more space in between individual modules. This is the separate function. And so each of the green lines indicates a thicker amount of space in between content than internally. What you'll see here is the purple space is all the little spaces in between the individual content within a single module or section. And so it's really important that when you're designing your modules that you keep in mind like your internal spacing, and then when you bring them all together, you keep in mind the spacing in between your modules. So like I said, you can decide on whatever you want as a staff for those spacing amounts to be. Typically, within a module, we're seeing between half a pica and a pica of space in between each element. And then between modules, typically 3, which is half of an inch, is probably the minimum, sometimes 4, sometimes 5, depending on whatever your look and feel ends up being. Remember, white space is your friend. And even if you have backgrounds on your pages and it's not literal white space, please give everything room to breathe. It's going to make your content really look a lot better, a lot more professional, but also draw attention to the things that you want. If you open a book and you are overwhelmed by all the different content on there, you're not being driven, the audience isn't being driven to anything in particular. And so they're all over the place. It looks and feels very chaotic, and it actually takes away from the great work that you're doing. So even if you have great photography and great captions and great storytelling, if it's not designed in a way that helps tell that story, it can actually take away from it. So allowing everything to have its own room to breathe is going to help you so much. Okay, and then lastly, I think it's also really important to touch on different ways that you can get creative with your coverage. So when you're doing your modules, whether it's on a traditional layout or you're doing modular coverage in general, be creative with the ways that you tell these stories. I've used a couple of examples over and over again, like Q&As and headshots and quotes and a timeline, but there are so many things you can do, and this is just an example of a starter list. There are probably hundreds of thousands of things that you can do to tell stories, and I really recommend you go and look at magazines, look at mainstream media, look at social media, especially sports channels are really good at this kind of stuff. There's so many different options you can do for modules. The sky is the limit. There is absolutely, there is no definitive list for this. This is just a quick list to show you some that you can do when it comes to modules, and there's creative ways to do them even within this list. So I'll walk you through some examples just so you can see them though. So the first one, starting with quotes. We've talked a lot about this. You've seen a lot of examples. You always want to show and not just tell. So anytime that you can show a person's face instead of just their text, it's always going to make it better, but it's not bad if you can't. So along the bottom, you'll see that there's like a little line that runs along probably the bottom of a spread, and it's featuring 7 students. That's great. That features so many students in the book, and that's not a bad thing. So depending on the type of content, if you can't fit a headshot in it, don't stress about it. It's more important that the content is there than you have a headshot. But also don't stress about getting headshots. Try to look for candidates that you already have of people. These pictures of these wrestlers were the pictures they probably already had of their official portraits. Pictures below are of them actually winning their match. You probably have pictures of students running on a field, doing something active. Cut that picture out and use that as their headshot. You don't have to go and take a picture of their headshot in the hallway. Mini stories I've mentioned quite a lot as well, super popular. There's a lot of different things that you can do to use a mini story, lots of different types of content. How-tos are super fun. They are also a really great way to show in-depth behind-the-scenes stuff at something that not everyone gets to do. So this is a how-to step-by-step throw something and get it in, in a pottery class into the kiln. Unless you're in pottery class, you don't know what it means to throw a pot, to glaze it, to put it in the kiln, to make sure it doesn't explode, because if you have a hole in it, it can explode. And so it's really cool to show that behind-the-scenes stuff. Also, it gives you a number, which is a really fun way to design stuff. We'll talk more about statistics in a second, but it just gives you so much content to be able to put and also tell that story of that particular topic that you have that would not normally be seen. Then we have Q&As, which we talked about. It's kind of like the quotes and headshots, but Q&As are a little bit more specific. And so they're typically about something, related to your topic in a very specific way. But also they can be super related to your theme. They don't have to be just generic questions. I will say if you're getting crappy answers, it's probably because you're asking crappy questions, and that goes for all interviews. But just kind of keep in mind if your answers are something like, yeah, I play basketball because it's really fun and I get to bond with my friends. Did you ask them why they love basketball? Yeah, you got a crappy question. You got a crappy answer because you asked a crappy question. And I know that that's kind of harsh, and I know that that's not probably what you want to hear, and I know you probably don't want to be blamed for it, because I also know it's really hard to get good answers from students, especially post-COVID. It's like people forgot how to talk to each other, and they don't want to talk to strangers, and I get it. It's scary. But at the same time, your job as a journalist is to go and build relationship, build rapport with them, and get those better answers by asking better questions. So if you're getting crappy answers, take a step back and take some responsibility and evaluate, are my questions crappy? They might be. It's okay. We can improve that though. Okay, we talked a lot about timelines also, but I wanted to show you some different examples. I always say content is king, right? I say make the template fit the content. And if you have a big, long, skinny box, it makes sense for a timeline, blah, blah, blah. But I don't want you to think that that's a hard and fast rule. Remember, we break the rules once we know the rules. And so now that you know the rules, you have permission to break them if you want to. So in this particular spread on the left, they had a box and they wanted to do a timeline. And so they'd have to rearrange the entire spread in order to fit a timeline in there. Their theme was also very boxy, and so it didn't really make sense to have something that was really long and skinny and kind of break the rest of the continuity of their spreads in order to make this fit. So they made it work, and this is a beautiful, cool timeline with these little arrows pointing from box to box to box, instead of forcing the layout to fit a line timeline, where it's very skinny. And so I think they did a great job of making that work. Even though it's not traditional, it absolutely worked with their theme, their design aesthetic, and they made it work. It looks great. All right, so the next one is a poll. Polls are really great to do. You can typically do a lot of really easy, quick content, especially if you have a robust social media channel. You can throw these polls out, no problem, get lots of quick feedback. But it's also important that you do a couple of things journalistically when you're doing polls. The first one is that you have enough of a sample size. So if you have a poll and you've surveyed 10 people, and then you're like 50% of people love soda better than juice, but you've only interviewed 10 people and they're in the soda enthusiast club or whatever, obviously that's going to be the case. So you have to make sure that you have a wide sample size across multiple grade levels, multiple genders, multiple different groups, depending on what the topic is, obviously. And you also want to make sure that you have enough students. So if you go to a school with 1,000 students, you probably need over a couple hundred people to respond to something in an ideal world, if it's something that reaches the entire school. If it's a poll about the football team, then obviously just interview the football team. But if it's something with the whole school, you need a pretty large sample size in order to really poll the whole student body. So the other thing I'll say with polls is you want to localize them to your campus. So if we were to do a poll or use a sunglasses one about what we wear, the numbers are more or less going to look the same at any campus, especially in your geographic area. And so I really like what they did on this bottom one, where they have the poll and they have the percentages and whatever, but then they also have quotes about it. So they've pulled out some opinion from each of the answers, and they've talked about why that person chose that. So it'd be really great if the sunglasses one had little poll quotes, even better if it had headshots, that said someone that chose Oakley's, why did they choose that? that, and that kind of stuff. It localizes it to your student body and your campus. But otherwise, there's lots of things you can do visually. Don't feel like you're stuck also with like bar graphs and pie charts and stuff like that. There's so many things you can do. Look up infographic visuals. There's a lot of cool little things you can do with polls. All right, so the next one is numbers. There are so many things you can do with numbers. They're a visual element that is a really great way to tell the behind the scenes of something. One year I had a student want to do the tech theater page, and so they wanted to do statistics of tech theater, and I was like, go for it. So they went to the tech theater director and they asked them, how many gallons of paint did you use? How many tiles did you do on the floor for the set? How many power tools were purchased this year versus how many of you have you had in the past, and then were there any injuries, and even like down to the minor stuff like paper cuts, and then they asked them, how many screws did you use? And he was like, bro, I have no idea, like how would I know how many screws I've used? Like, it's thousands. And so they actually were like, okay, well, can we figure it out? Like, can we count, or can we look at the inventory? So they looked at the purchase orders for how many they ordered in this current year. It was kind of an estimate because they already had some, but they didn't really know how many and whatever. And then they were able to figure out more or less how many screws they used on this year's theater performance show. And the director was like, I can't believe that your student, told me this information. I had no idea how many screws we used. And I realized that if I actually bought them for 3 years or something at a time, knowing that I'm going to use this many, I can save like 25% on my screw budget. And I was like, okay, that's awesome. Like, my little student journalists are like uncovering the truth or something to help you with this. And it was totally selfishly motivated. We were just trying to get content for the yearbook, but it was actually super helpful to him. So there's lots of different things you can do with content like this. Like, it's not that your goal is to like revolutionize the theater department, but like, it's cool to look at that behind the scenes stuff. Like, think about how many staplers are in the school building, or how many staples the school buys every year, or how much paper, or how many expo markers. Like, there's so many things that we as students or as a school are consumers of, and like looking at those statistics, I don't know, to me it's super interesting. And visually, numbers are such a good design element. I love when schools use numbers as a module. And then also I love when schools look at the price of things and the trends with that. So on the side, you'll see how much a cheerleading uniform is. I had no idea it was this expensive, but the bow is $7, the pom-poms are $44, the uniform is $236, which seems outrageous, and then the shoes are $114, and so it's about $400, and I think this is a couple years old, so it's probably even more than that. And so it's interesting, especially right now, because you guys are living in a time where you can see inflation happening. I never thought that I would live long enough to see inflation happening. We hear about how cheeseburgers were 5 cents back in the 1920s or whatever, and I'm like, I can't even fathom that. Like, there's $8 now, like whatever. I can't even think about a time where they were that cheap. But now we're living in a time where things are increasing because of inflation exponentially. And so the price of things now versus 10 years from now, or even 2 or 3 years from now, is going to be drastically different. And so it's really cool to document that kind of stuff. Put in your book the price of gas, the price of a gallon of milk, a loaf of bread. So I had a student tell me that they track inflation by the price of waffles, because waffles used to be like 87 cents for a pack of 12, and now they're like $3 or $4. And I was like, you know what? You're right though. Like, that might be a benchmark. So whatever you want to like use as your benchmark in your book, a gallon of gas and a gallon of milk are very standard. But there's so many things that you can do with statistics that I think are not only interesting from a content perspective, but also super interesting to look at visually. So that's it for advanced layout design. I hope that this has inspired you to really get creative with your content and not just do the basic captions and photos. Obviously we need those, but we also want to be a lot more intentional and give our audience something interesting to look at, give them more behind the scenes information, really be investigative with your content, and also try and relate that to your theme. So be sure to join us for the last session in the next video where we talk about planning your ladder. All right, I'll see you there. Bye.